My name is Dr. G. Welcome to That's Unusual, my podcast uncovering the unusual stories behind the world's most interesting people. On this show, we celebrate what makes us different and how we convert those differences into unexpected opportunities. Hello, unusual friends. Welcome to another episode of That's Unusual. A big thanks goes out to all of my listeners and subscribers. There are thousands and thousands of you. I greatly appreciate that. You know what, if you haven't done so already, I would greatly appreciate it if you can go back in and leave me a review on either iTunes or Google Play. Helps me out a great deal. Thank you. So let's face it, when it comes to addressing education, the medical profession is a bit behind the ball. While the field of medicine is innovating at exponential rates, the way we train doctors is still moving at a snail's pace. My esteemed guest today, Dr. Margaret Cary, also known as Maggie, is a world-renowned leadership coach who knows a thing or two when it comes to the required attributes to become a successful and happy, I might add, physician in this rapidly evolving industry. On today's show, Maggie and I attempt to define the role of the future physician, what attributes are necessary for success, and why leadership is a critical skill that has historically not been taught to medical professionals. Maggie also explains why coaching is in high demand within the health profession and even shares a few of her own professional techniques on how to lead. So join me today while Maggie and I go deep into exploring how we can create leaders out of doctors to meet the future demands of an ever-changing profession. As you listen to this episode, I ask that you reflect on your own unusual stories and unique qualities that can help open doors to unexpected opportunities. And so with that, let's get started. Welcome to another episode of That's Unusual. I have with me as my guest today, Dr. Margaret Cary, most commonly referred to by her friends as Maggie. So I'll call you Maggie. Welcome to the show, Maggie.
Thank you.
So you have been around the block in healthcare in a variety of different ways. Of course, you're a physician, but you're also a leadership coach amongst many other things that you've done over the course of your career. I really want to drill into this notion of coaching in today's world of healthcare, because I think it's a very important topic, especially given the fact that we are encountering so many changes in the ecosystem of healthcare and how we think about the roles of physicians and other healthcare providers. So maybe a good place to start, Maggie, if you don't mind, is there's probably a lot of definitions or misunderstanding around what leadership coaching actually is. Maybe you can start there and tell us in your words how you think about coaching.
Oh, that's a great question. First of all, I think the name coaching, at least in medicine, probably needs an update because in the past we've used it for, quote, bad doctors. You know, you coach because you've done something bad, and by the way, we're going to fire you, but we're going to give you a coach on the way out. And which fit, of course, into the blame and shame culture of medicine. My work is really about helping organizations to become more effective. So if you're a very competent organization and you're, in essence, running a marathon, but you've got a thorn in your toe. Now, you're still effective, but you've got a thorn in your big toe. I'm the person who can help you take that out in terms of human interactions.
Yeah, that's a good way to think about it. So are you seeing, how did you get into this line of coaching? Is that something that you were just sort of natural at? Did you train around it? And what kinds of coaching assignments are you doing today?
Well, I guess I got into it because there wasn't much else I could do. And then I'll append that to say that took into account all the places I've been and all the things I've done. I also saw a huge use for it when I wrote my book on telemedicine, because it turns out that buying the technology or anything, as you know better than most people, is only part of the problem. It's really, how do you create the group? How do you implement that? How do you get people to buy in, and how do you move that forward? And yes, I'm professionally trained. As you probably know, coaching, you can pretty much hang a shingle out, but I'm what's called I have a professional coaching credential, which means I have over 750 hours. And right now I have close to 2,000.
Wow. Yeah, coaching is certainly, the more I learn about it and the more, of course, I interact with you and other coaches, it's both an art and a science. And it's really something that I think only a few are really capable of doing. And I think you're an excellent at doing this. And I think the timing of this couldn't be more perfect in terms of, a physician as a coach coaching other physicians in better leadership positions or to become better leaders, I should say, because healthcare is going through a massive transformation on every facet you can imagine, right? So maybe to understand where coaching can best be applied amongst physicians and other healthcare providers, what are you seeing as sort of the biggest changes occurring amongst the roles of physicians that coaching is becoming that much more imperative?
Let me approach that from two kind of angles. One from a physician who's mostly a clinician, and one from a physician who's moving into management roles. And for the clinician, they can learn how to be a wellness coach for patients. And what's changing is that patients no longer are flat and in bed, they're up and walking, and they want healthcare advisors rather than a parent to tell them what to do. And I think that that's important for clinicians. Now, that's a different kind of coaching from what I do. What I do is really focused on physicians in management and leadership roles. And why that is helpful is because in medical school, we are not taught how to play in the sandbox together well. We are taught to be the boss. Think of the operating room. And in the operating room, or if you've just been in a car wreck and you go to an emergency room, you want somebody to take control who knows what he or she's doing. You don't want somebody to be standing around and saying, so what do you think? How do you think about that? So again, coaching is used in specific situations and for different kinds of coaching. What it does, the coach generally holds up a mirror, asks questions to help the client figure out on his or her own what to do. Now, I will say that most of us believe in being of service to the client, so we sort of rotate among roles as coach, facilitator, mediator, consultant, and it's being able to pivot quickly and be agile with your client.
So it's interesting that you bring up that analogy of the mirror. I recently wrote a blog post talking about the mirror, in fact, gives us a false perception of ourselves because it's us looking at our own selves from our own lens.
Right.
And part of what I feel is also important is to understand how we are perceived from other people. Does that come into play or into account as you evaluate people in terms of their leadership and management capability?
Absolutely, because perception is the reality. And there's a thing in coaching called the ladder of inference. And the ladder of inference means that when you see something, you immediately start climbing the ladder of inference. So let me give you a quick example. You see somebody with arms crossed, and you immediately think that person doesn't like you. And that person doesn't like you because blah, 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 blah. You start climbing that ladder of inference. And by the time you get to the top and you look back down, that person was just cold. And not being negative towards you. So in coaching, clients, it helps them to understand perceptions of other people, because what we see in ourselves is not necessarily what other people see us. And I think I was in the political role in the federal government, and one of the things that was drilled into us is perception is the reality, period.
Yeah, that's absolutely so true. A lot of our listeners, I'd imagine, are in leadership roles, or at least have ambitions to be within leadership roles. How do you as an individual, how does one as an individual recognize whether they indeed need some sort of coaching assistance?
That is a really good question. And, as trained as a scientist, I always like to talk about the data. And I think you need a starting point to know where you're from. And what that usually involves is what's called a 360 assessment. And there's many of them online. I find the most effective ones to be where I go and interview a sampling of people who have worked with the person I will be coaching. And preferably, and sometimes I even like to interview the spouse, because the behavior we do at work is likely the same as home and vice versa. So we start from a position of, here's my observations. I interviewed 12 people, and here's the trends. Here's the things I heard from them that they commonly said. What do you think? The client then chooses 1, 2, or 3 goals, and we come up with signposts on the way to getting that goal. That's one type of coaching. Another type of coaching is being an honest broker or being a CEO confidant. How do people know they need a coach? Well, if you talk to the Fast Company recently had an article by the president of Shopify who absolutely did not want a coach. And once he got one, he now has, I think, a dozen or so internal coaches for his employees. So do you need a coach? Yeah. You may not be, if you need, but only one if you want to be high performing and want somebody to give you honest feedback.
Do you feel like it requires somebody to essentially self-select or at least be motivated to want coaching in order for it to be effective? I mean, what about those who, you identify through the data that says, hey, this person might require some coaching, or some organization hires you to evaluate their employees and staff? How do you deal with those who resist or believe that they don't need any coaching?
I don't coach them.
So part of the prerequisite is they have to self-recognize and be willing to participate.
Right.
In order for it to be effective.
Yes, willing to at least give it a go. If they absolutely don't want it, it won't work.
Mm-hmm. So what, in your view, going back to this notion of, sort of redefining the role of a physician or the future physician, what in your view or in your perspective makes for a good doctor? I know it's a loaded question, but
yeah. And I've asked that in several interviews I've done, and there seems to be this combination of having a certain amount of knowledge. You don't have to be expert in everything all the time, but having a certain amount of knowledge so you can recognize patterns and recognize possibilities. I think you also need to be curious, because sometimes the hoofbeats in the hall just might be zebras, which is a referral, of course, to medical school. And sometimes you will see things that are unusual. And also, I think you have to be a lifelong learner and have a curiosity, just a curiosity about things and how they work. If you go into management, you need to become much more comfortable with things such as chaos, with things such as risk, with other things that might not be as acceptable in patient care, because the risks are what could happen bad is so devastating. Whereas in management and leadership, you often have to make decisions on incomplete information.
Yeah, that makes good sense. We're at a very interesting time period in the world of healthcare where we're undergoing a massive transformation, but we still have those physicians who were trained under the traditional format that we're all sort of familiar with from the past, and then the younger generation, we'll call them the millennial generation, who are now coming up in sort of this new reality, this new normal of advances in healthcare. Are you seeing a spectrum of differences, or talk about the spectrum of differences? Let's just take, a snapshot of the millennial physician today versus a snapshot of the physician who trained in the 50s or 60s.
Most of my clients trained probably in the 70s or 80s.
Mm-hmm.
So,
let's take that time frame.
Okay, let's take that time frame. With the millennials, as you know, I'm coaching a medical student named Jack Penner, who's given me permission to use his name, and we're writing together and speaking together and doing workshops together. And one of the things I've noticed, when I was a medical student, I was just trying to get to pass. So I don't even know what my colleagues were like, except on Saturday evening when I'd try to go to all three parties I'd been invited to so I could dance. But that wasn't exactly conducive to looking at how they were. But it sure was fun. So what I'm seeing with these students is, first of all, in general, no matter where you are in medicine, we have a huge incidence of imposter syndrome, which is where we wonder, why would anybody pay us to care for them? Am I really a doctor? It's not just with students, it's with everybody. With the students, I find they're very willing and open to share. Oh, you feel that way? Yeah, so do I. They're also, at least in the group we're working with, much more willing to be vulnerable, but keeping the vulnerability in mind not to go too far, because your attendings are those who are going to write you letters so you can get to the residency you want. But as a group, I find that they're very open to sharing their experiences and their foibles.
Yeah, it's funny, when I look at the sort of the spectrum of physicians, not know if it's a factor of just, at what time frame they were trained, but I look at the older generation of practicing physicians, and they tend to be a lot more resistant to change. Whereas the younger ones, and perhaps it's just a factor of because they are younger and new and not yet, having been practicing for a couple of decades, the younger ones tend to be a little bit more accepting of experimentation and adaptability and change as things come along. Are you seeing those differences as well? Right.
But see, I don't know if it's age dependent.
Yeah.
Because, when we were younger, certainly we did crazy things too. I don't know if it's age dependent or if it's necessarily generational dependent. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, these are interesting things. I mean, I just looking at the spectrum and profiles of physicians, it always fascinates me to see part of this fundamental change that we need to undergo in healthcare is going to require a right mindset amongst these physicians. And I just think, having someone like you looking at the spectrum of these physicians and how you tackle it from a coaching perspective to bring them up as leaders is so critically important. We can innovate till the end of the world, and that's going to continue. But if we don't get the right mindset and the right leadership culture amongst these physicians, it doesn't matter how good of an innovation we produce, nothing's ever going to happen without that correct mindset. So extremely important work. I want to get into this thing that you're working on with Jack Penner, your medical student that you're affiliated with, and the Whole New Doctor, which I'm aware of and have been participating in. But before we get to that, I like stories. Can you share, I know I'm sort of putting you on the spot here, but can you share, one of the most challenging coaching story you've had, and perhaps one of the best, most successful story that you can think of?
I think the most challenging one was also one of my most successful ones. So I was asked to coach a physician, a surgeon, one of those macho surgery specialties. And I read the report of his 360, which is an evaluation of how other people think about you and how you think about yourself and how it compares. And after reading his evaluation, I asked the head of HR, why do you want to keep this guy? Because it wasn't a very good report. And she responded, we just hired this guy from fancy Northeast Medical School, and he's very good technically. And I started working with him, and there were two things that there was one main thing that caused him to change. And that was this organization uses physician's assistants as the first assist in surgery. So every surgeon has his or her own assistant. The surgeon was getting a new assistant, a new PA, and couldn't figure out how to talk to this person because the PA reported up through the PA silo and the doc reported up through the doc silo. And I kept holding up that mirror, Kathleen. boy, there was no perception. And finally I went into consultant mode and said, what would happen if you just went and sat down next to him on the bench in the male changing room and looked him in the eyes and said, hey, listen, we're going to be working together. What about getting together to talk? And there was a dead silence. I thought he'd hung up on me. And this little voice comes and says, I never thought of that. And what I said to him was, by this time we knew each other pretty well. I said, your problem is people think you lie and you're a jerk. And we know that's not true, but that's not the perception. And I guarantee you, if you do this, the perception of others will change. And he could barely wait till our next coaching session to tell me how things had changed. It was so gratifying.
That's certainly a good example of a challenging turned into a successful outcome. Tell us about, so you've shared with me, some of the work that you're doing with medical students and really preparing them for this future world of medicine and preparing them to be better leaders as physicians. And I believe this initiative's called the Whole New Doctor right. Initiative that you're working on. Tell us more about that and what's that experience been like?
Well, I'm coaching Jack, and we wanted to sort of share the wealth. So we came up with this idea to do a workshop. Now, if you've ever worked in medical schools, they're very, very conservative. So
putting it nicely.
So we knew that if we went through, and I teach at this medical school, I teach reflective writing, and I tried to propose some other courses and was told it was going to take 3 years because it had to go through this committee and that committee, and then they had to see if it fit with the competencies. And I'm just not that kind of a person, right? I'm a jump in, let's do it person, and operations drive me crazy. So he and I said, well, let's go through another avenue. So we went through totally legally at one of the learning societies, and we advertised for students. We got 12. We had our kick. We thought we'd do 2 or 3 workshops in 12 months, but we just don't have the bandwidth. This is all self-funded. So we had our first workshop for 12 students, and there were some very interesting pieces. I talked about coaching. Jack talked about polarity thinking. We also got Peggy O'Kane to talk about meditation. She's the head of the National Committee on Quality Assurance and also a credentialed meditation teacher. One of the big surprises as I sat in the back of the room was to see how engaged the students were during meditation. You could have heard a pin drop.
Wow.
And they loved the meditation in the feedback that we got. And so she's coming back to do that. And what I wanted them to see was that meditation and all those things, people in very, very high roles do them and get advantages to them. And Peggy's also a really good storyteller and speaker. And so then I got each of the 12 students their own coach, 10 one-hour sessions pro bono with coaches who normally charge a lot of money. And I just asked the coaches and our speakers if they'd like to join us in creating the future of medicine, because we didn't have the name A Whole New Doctor then. We've been working on the name. And so the coaching, then I debriefed with them at my house. We called the first cohort our advisory board, and we meet for a Sunday brunch at my house. Now, keep in mind, the workshop was on a Saturday, and there was no credit involved.
Mm-hmm.
The students, as well as the faculty and coaches, are volunteer. They loved it. So we thought we'd do another one. And Jack really works with each student individually. And I said, how many more can you handle? He thought a dozen. So we thought we'd have 12. And then he called me up and said, we have 19 applications and they're really good. It was kind of like when your kid comes and says, look at the dog I found. Can we keep him? And I said, sure. And then I thought, oh no, I have to get coaches for 12 more, for 19 students. But most of our coaches re-upped, and those that didn't, it's because of a time constraint, but they referred their friends. So we've now got 19 coaches. We also, I guess I should say that the program is really operating, it's part of the school, but it's really not of the school. And so we wrote up our successes. We are totally, I'm the faculty member. I'm doing this because it's my passion, but it's pretty much student run. Mm-hmm. And I think that's critical here. The other thing is it's all volunteer, because if you force students to do something, like some people don't want to be coached, then it's toxic. And by the way, not everybody has to be coached. They all volunteered, but we don't require that. We're really building a community. We also said, we said that any workshops or interactions with medical students have to be adult learning techniques, because medical students are adults. Mm-hmm. We also have this ability to pivot because we don't have to go through all these layers of requests to make sure it's okay. And you know what had happened in 3 years? It'd be like sausage. It wouldn't look like, whatever we put into it, it'd be totally changed. So we really made that effort. There's, and the good part, it gives us the freedom to do things with the 19. Go ahead. Sorry.
So it sounds like from the first cohort, if we're to sort of call that a pilot, so to say, it was really successful, as demonstrated from the increase in demand and attendance for the second one. This is something that I see as an imperative across all medical schools, right? You can certainly incorporate this into the curriculum for new schools, such as the Dell Medical School, which is part of University of Texas in Austin. But majority of schools are still running under the old curriculums. So how, and I'm sure you've probably thought about this, what have you learned and how do we ultimately take what you're doing and scale that across other medical schools?
Well, Jack and I are looking at this about how to make it sustainable. The idea is we'll form a company. We'll also have a not-for-profit arm, because we don't want any medical student to not participate because he or she doesn't have the money. Mm-hmm. So we're looking at how to do that. It's interesting you mentioned Dell Medical School, because I've talked to the man who is a vascular surgeon who became an executive coach for very large organizations, is now in charge of their coaching and leadership, Eddie Erlandson. And he is coaching, as I understand, all the medical students himself. Their residents have a whole program about it, but he's a really interesting guy. He and I have talked several times. Ohio State University last year graduated its first medical school class that had coaches every year, all 4 years. There's another school in Florida and another one out on Long Island, but their coaching model's a little different. They have every student do it. Now, and we don't, in our model, we don't have every student do it. As I mentioned, people that don't want to do it will be a drag on those who do. Now, that said, Ohio State University does give it to every student, and they don't have coaching as frequently as we offer, but they develop a portfolio of their thoughts, the reflective thoughts that many of them use when they apply to residencies.
That's interesting. I think we certainly need more of these, and anyone listening who can contribute and be a part of this, I think it's important for all of us to get behind things like this. I attempted to revamp a medical education curriculum to bring in some of these soft skills and leadership skills to no success a couple of years ago. It was really frustrating. And I'm glad to see you making inroads and progress down this path. Before we get into sort of our closing session of rapid fire questions, if you don't mind, I would love for you to give a little bit of a freebie. I mean, if there was one single coaching tip that anyone listening in this audience, physician or not, that you would recommend them consider or doing or self-reflect, is there something that you can share with everybody?
Absolutely. But first, let me say, Gotham, you were an inspiration to me to create this, and you're part of the team now. So I think the most important thing that I could say, which really helped me, in medicine and in most things, we're trained to be fix-it people with differential diagnoses, and we eliminate them one by one. I think that the most important thing is really to listen, and not the words, but to watch body language and just shut up. Just shut up and listen.
Well said. Just shut up and listen. That's probably the most important advice. I think clearly not many people do often enough. And we like to think that we do, but in reality, we don't. Again, looking at it from the perception of others over reality. So great advice. Love hearing the work that you're up to. You know what? Before we get into the closing round, what's next for you? What's next on your docket?
I just want to have a wonderful life and live happily ever after.
Couldn't be said any better than that. Totally agree. And I'm with you on that one. All right. So let's jump into the sort of rapid fire lightning round. Maggie, and for those listening, I'm actually going to do something a little bit different today. And Maggie's got a little bit of a surprise. Most of my listeners know that I do a Mad Lib rapid fire fill in the blank. We're still going to do that. But before we get to that, I'm trying something new, and this is deploying word association. So I am going to present to you 6 words, Maggie. And very quickly, without thinking about it, and you have not seen these words before, I want you to sort of give back the first word that comes to mind in association to it. Sound good?
I'll try to stop my filters. Hope I work.
Okay. All right. We're going to get started with word association, something new on the That's Unusual podcast. First word for you, Maggie, love.
I was going to say love and I was thinking love in my head. So I'm going to respond with love.
Love. Okay, great. Next one, hate.
Thoughtful.
Wonder.
Awe.
Passion.
Love.
Opportunity.
Knox.
I like that. Regret.
Get over it.
Good. All right. Those are fun. Great answers. Love that, Maggie. All right. Now we're going to go on to the Mad Lib fill in the blanks. This is a regular segment that we do on the podcast. So we'll start off with the first one. The first one is the best piece of advice I ever received was?
Well, it's the best and the worst. It's focus.
Why the worst? Why would you consider that the worst?
Because I had a hard time focusing, and I finally decided it's because I'm a serial focuser.
Got it. Yep. I can see how that's the best and the worst. Okay, next one for you. I am most curious about?
How things work.
Yeah, me too. Good one. All right, next one. Looking back, what would you tell your 20-year-old self?
Spend more time with your friends and family. Don't take everything personally, and enjoy life.
Very important messages. Totally agree. Next one for you. If you had to write a book about yourself, essentially an autobiography, the title of the book would be?
Probably something like A Life Well Lived. Humor, hubris, and humility.
Very good. Yeah. I could totally see how that makes sense for you. Next, 2 more to go. Next one is, if you could invite 3 people over for dinner, dead or alive, who would you invite and what would you want to talk about?
So that's pretty much an easy one. I think about this a lot. Alexander the Great.
Okay.
Bruce Springsteen, and my dad. And we talk about
that's an interesting combination.
We talk about motivation, their successes and failures. Talk about what advice they would give to each other. And Alexander, how in the heck did you conquer the known world?
And tell us about your dad. I mean, why would you want your dad at the table?
My dad was sort of a Renaissance man, an aerospace engineer who knew a lot of stuff. His dad died when he was 13, so he was pretty much raised by a younger mom. Went off to World War II, was so nearsighted he had to stay and make bazooka guns. But he did because of the GI Bill, he was able to go to the University of Colorado, and then he went to Purdue to graduate school. And he was just a brilliant guy, but a total nerd. And I think that I would just want to be able to spend more time with him in discussions and find out more about him. I didn't really know him that well because I was also raised by a single mom.
Well, yeah, that makes a good sense to have him at the table. Certainly lots to talk about. Good three. I like those three. Very different from what I've heard before. All right, the last question for you, Maggie. So, of course, on this podcast, we like to celebrate everything that makes us unique and what makes us different. We call that unusual. So with that, how would you fill in the following blank? I'm unusual because...
Well, I'd have to go back. I'm a serial focuser. I'd also add because my great joy is sharing what I've learned.
Yeah. Sharing what you've learned. That's great. And, certainly something that I can validate. You certainly taught me a lot in the process. And Maggie, it's so great having this conversation with you. Even though I've known you for some time, every time I speak to you, I learn something new. So thank you for sharing your insights and your wisdom with me and everyone listening.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Before we close up here, for those who wanted to learn more about you, about your books, your writing, your coaching, where would you direct them to go?
They can link in with me, or they can go to the Cary Group Global, and that's spelled TheCary Group, GROUP Global. And I'd like to recommend a coaching book written by a guy that I met. Mm-hmm. I have no financial interest in this, but it's called The Coaching Habit. Say less, ask more, and change the way you lead forever.
Okay, great. Sounds like a great book. I'll have to pick up a copy myself.
It's fabulous.
Good. Well, thank you for all those tips, Maggie. It was great having you on the show again.
You're welcome.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Hi again. It's me, Dr. G. If you are still listening, I'm hoping it's because you enjoyed this podcast. If you would like to hear future episodes, you could really help me out by subscribing to the That's Unusual podcast on iTunes and leaving a review. It goes a long way in helping me get the word out from avid listeners like you. As a thank you, I will be selecting one new reviewer each week at random for a free private 15-minute phone conversation where you can ask me anything and get professional advice on your career or business to help you stand out and make a difference. Also, if you want to be notified of any future episodes, please visit that'sunusualpodcast.com and sign up to receive updates on new episode releases. Until next time, remember to always think unusual.